How did the Detroit Pistons win the 2004 NBA championship? The Detroit Pistons had dominated the NBA in the late 1980s. Then, they put together a team known universally as the Bad Boys of basketball. The name was not always affectionate, as it denoted an aggressive and borderline violent style of play. But it brought results. The team stars were Hall of Famers Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars, but the physical contributions of Bill Laimbeer and Dennis Rodman really set them apart. This excellent and intimidating outfit won 3 conference titles in a row and 2 NBA titles in 1989 and 1990. However, by 1993, that golden era had come to an end. The Pistons bagged a brilliant player in Grant Hill and expected him to lead Detroit to future glory. But the team fell on hard times between his injury problems and some misguided decision-making in the front office. Despite having a significant amount of talent, the Pistons hadn't been able to advance beyond the first round of the playoffs since the end of the Bad Boys era. In fact, half of the time, they hadn't even made the playoffs. They even changed the team colors to an ungodly teal color, much to the dissatisfaction of their hardcore fans. In 2000, Hill decided to make the most of free agency and was interested in a move to Orlando. However, Detroit agreed to trade him to the Magic instead, and the star bid adieu to the Motor City. Without the face of the franchise, the Pistons faced an identity crisis. They had no big-time players and were wearing weird uniforms. If this franchise were a person, they would look at themselves in the mirror and say, "I don't know who you are anymore." Enter Joe Dumars. Joe Dumars was among the most instrumental players on the 2-time title-winning Pistons team. He continued his elite-level service to the Pistons throughout most of the Grant Hill era, retiring at the end of the 1998-99 season. A year later, the Pistons made the wise decision to appoint the retired guard as team president. What followed was a series of moves to rebuild the team altogether. You know those movies where a ragtag group of misfits is put together for a big heist and succeed beyond their wildest dreams? It was a bit like that. Dumars and the front office brought in an unlikely cast of characters and built a legendary championship team. His first move was to trade Hill, who was on his way out anyway, in return for 2 players. Detroit received second-year guard Chucky Atkins and center Ben Wallace. It seemed like an underwhelming return for a future Hall of Famer. Wallace was considered a mediocre center. But of course, players in the NBA are primarily measured by how many points they score. And Big Ben, as he was known, didn't score many of them. The center had scored 4 points per game for Orlando in 1999-2000. To make matters worse, he seemed incapable of hitting free throws. Sure, Wallace was known as a capable rebounder, but not enough to compensate for his abysmal offensive capabilities. Or so the common wisdom went. We will never know if Dumars saw incredible potential in Big Ben or just lucked out. But the Pistons made Wallace their starting center, and he simply took off. Ben soon emerged as one of the best defensive players in the league and took down a staggering 13.2 rebounds per game in his first season. Sure, he still couldn't score, but he was doing so much for the team that Big Ben didn't need to. And best of all, he had come so cheap that the Pistons had spending power to build around Wallace. Every championship team needs a top-class point guard who makes the players around him better. Dumars found his man in Chauncey Billups, who entered free agency after a strong year with the Timberwolves. Though he had a good season, the point guard was considered to be something of a disappointment. Billups was a McDonald's All-American in 1995 and a 3rd pick in the 1997 NBA draft, but he hadn't become the top-tier guard he was projected to become. As it turns out, Chauncey was the ideal choice. His performance in the 2004 NBA Finals earned him a Series MVP. The point guard's clutch performances would grant him the well-deserved nickname Mr. Big Shot, and Detroit was the right home for the player in the long term. He finally realized all that potential. Chauncey was an all-star 5 times running, from 2006 to 2010. Honestly, considering how impressive a career the Billupses had, it is a bit surprising that he isn't a Hall of Famer. Next to Billups, the Pistons placed Richard Hamilton as shooting guard. Then, the UConn graduate was obtained in a trade involving All-Star Jerry Stackhouse. This one was a shocker because Stackhouse had set a Pistons record with 29.8 points in the 2000-2001 season, a team record that still stands. But Rip was 3 years younger and more of a team player, a quality Dumars deeply valued. In Rasheed Wallace, no relation to Big Ben, the Pistons obtained a proven star. Detroit landed the power forward in a multiplayer deal involving Chucky Atkins, who was dispatched to Boston. Rasheed was already a two-time All-Star and was an All-American picked third in the draft. If so, his pedigree was evident. But just as importantly, he was an old-school Piston in the bad boys mold. The forward committed 41 technical fouls in 2000-2001 and still holds the single-season record. No wonder Dumars saw a kindred spirit in the guy. As the Pistons entered the 2003-2004 season with this talented core, the front office had put together an impressive supporting cast. The second-year Turkish player Mehmet Okur provided a strong bench alternative to the Wallaces. Meanwhile, forward Rasheed Prince, also in his second year, was ready to make a giant leap in ability. He used his preternaturally long arms to bedevil defenders and add an unexpected weapon to the Detroit arsenal. In 2003-2004, Detroit Pistons didn't have a prominent franchise player like Grant Hill, but they had bushels of character, grit, and let's be honest, naked aggression. They were a typical Pistons team and proud of it. Oh, and they no longer played in those hideous teal uniforms. Detroit had a good 2002-2003 season, sharing the best record in the Eastern Conference with the Sixers. However, they were swept by the Nets in the conference finals. Despite a solid performance, Dumars fired coach Rick Carlisle and replaced him with veteran Larry Brown. It seemed like a strange move at the time, and ESPN columnist Rick Bucher wrote, "What ESPN.com asked me to do in this column is explain why Carlisle was called at his vacation home in the Carolinas Friday night and fired with a year left on his 3-year contract. The truth is, I can't. But there was a method to the madness. Though Carlisle is doubtless an excellent coach, Brown is one of the greatest basketball minds of his generation. A Hall of Famer, he led 7 NBA teams to the playoffs and won an NCAA national title. So, perhaps Dumars felt Larry's wealth of experience would help whip this ragtag talented team into champions. If so, he was right. Billups said of Brown, "He gets a little crazy sometimes, but we always know that it's all about the game. He just wants to win, and that's the bottom line, and he just wants to make you a better player. No agendas, nothing like that. He cares about winning, and he truly cares about the guys. When he's going crazy and things like that, you can respect it more than anything because you know he cares." Therefore, it is no surprise that Brown ably picked up where Carlisle had left off. The team had a solid regular season and improved their record from 50-32 the previous year to 54-28. However, they finished behind the Reggie Miller-led Indiana Pacers in the East. Detroit brushed aside the Milwaukee Bucks in the first round 4-1, despite losing the second game at the Palace of Auburn Hills. The next round was a bigger challenge. Brown's boys faced Jason Kidd and the Nets. The same team that had swept them the previous season cost Carlisle his job. The season was all-out warfare. Perhaps the highlight of the series came in Game 5, when Billups heaved a half-court buzzer beater to tie the game. Detroit won in 7. The defense did it, as the reincarnated Bad Boys held the Nets to 69 points. The Indiana Pacers were favorites in the Eastern Conference Finals. As the first seeds, they had a home advantage. And to make matters more interesting, it was a grudge match. The Pacers' head coach was one Rick Carlisle, who wanted to prove to Dumars that he had made a mistake in letting the younger coach go. Sure, Rick played it down and said, when it was over, it was about focusing positive energy on the next thing that was going to happen, so I have not dwelled on it much at all. But you have to say that, right? But Carlisle's revenge fantasies were stymied. The Pistons recovered from losing Game 1 and returned to take the series 4-2. Once again, the defensive onslaught of the Pistons made the difference. Big Ben led the way in shutting down Reggie Miller, Jermaine O'Neal, and friends, keeping them to a pathetic 65 in the last 2 games. Detroit came into the NBA Finals as complete underdogs. Their rivals, the Los Angeles Lakers, were one of the best teams the sport had ever seen. Phil Jackson had led the Lakers to 3 straight championships in 2000-2002. And while Tim Duncan and the Spurs had won it all in 2003, the flashy Angelinos were expected to pick up where they had left off. And it's easy to see why. Jackson was coaching a team chock full of future Hall of Famers. Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal were, of course, the biggest stars on the team. But that year, the lineup was completed by Karl Malone and Gary Payton. It was a team built to win now and win big. But the star power of the Lakers was no match for the chemistry of the Pistons and their ridiculous defensive prowess. Game 3 was a case in point. Despite all the offensive tools in the Lakers' arsenal, Brown and his team managed to keep them to a measly 68 points, the lowest tally for any team in the finals in over 15 years. The Pistons won their first title in 14 years in front of their adoring fans in Game 5. Big Ben pulled out all the stops and kept Shaquille to a mere 20 as the Pistons won their 3rd championship at the Palace. In a series with Shaq and Kobe, Billups was the unexpected MVP. He was on fire, averaging 21 points, 5.2 assists, and 1.2 steals per game. But it was Chauncey's 3-pointers that truly put the nail in the Laker coffin, as he buried 47% from beyond the arc. The Pistons won through teamwork, defense, discipline, and chemistry. Most of all, this group had grit and character. In today's less physical and more offensive-oriented game, we may never see the likes of the legendary 2003-2004 Detroit Pistons again. Too bad.